Some folks spend their whole lives searching for peace, and Hank "Red" Mallory thought he'd finally found his in the Colorado mountains. After 3 tours in Vietnam and a lifetime of carrying other men's wars on his shoulders, all he wanted was the simple company of his dog Scout and the honest work of checking traplines in God's country. For 15 years, they lived quiet in a one-room cabin where the only sounds were wind through the pines and Scout's gentle breathing by the fire. But peace has a way of slipping through a man's fingers just when he needs it most. This morning, tracking a wounded elk through fresh snow, Red discovers something that don't belong in these sacred peaks. A grand brick mansion standing like a dark secret in the wilderness. The broken door and scattered tracks tell of recent violence, and what Red finds inside will force him back into a world he thought he'd left behind forever. What could drive dangerous men to build such a place in the middle of nowhere? Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The cabin sat at 9,000 feet, perched on a natural shelf of granite that God himself seemed to have carved for a man seeking solitude. Red had built it with his own hands 15 years back, when the ghosts of the Mekong Delta still whispered in his ears and the smell of napalm lingered in his dreams. Every log had been felled, stripped, and notched with deliberate care, the kind of methodical work that kept a man's mind from wandering into dark places. Scout padded across the rough-hewn floor, his nails clicking against the worn planks as the first light of dawn crept through the single window. The dog was getting on in years now, his black coat showing silver around the muzzle, but his amber eyes still held the alertness of a soldier. Red had found him as a pup during his second winter in these mountains, half frozen and abandoned by a pack that couldn't spare the weak. Sometimes Red wondered if Scout had saved him more than the other way around. "Morning, old boy," Red murmured, scratching behind the dog's ears where the leather collar bore a simple silver tag, not Scout's name, but Red's own military dog tag from a war fought in jungle heat, now carried by his faithful companion through mountain cold. It seemed fitting somehow. They'd both served their time in hell and found their peace together. The morning ritual never varied. Red pulled on his wool pants and flannel shirt, both patched and repatched over the years, but still serviceable. His hands, gnarled from decades of outdoor work but steady as stone, reached for the worn leather journal on the shelf beside his cot. The pages held 15 years of observations, weather patterns, animal migrations, the slow turning of seasons in high country. But tucked between sketches of traplines and notes about snow depth were fragments of another life, the curve of a Vietnamese village, the face of a young soldier who didn't make it home, the coordinates of a fire base that existed now only in memory. He closed the journal without writing. Some mornings the past felt too close, like it might spill out onto the clean pages of his mountain life. Outside, the San Juan Range stretched in every direction, peaks rising like cathedral spires into a sky so blue it hurt to look at. Red had chosen this place not just for its isolation, but for its honesty. The mountains didn't lie or make promises they couldn't keep. They demanded respect, preparation, and humility. In return, they offered something rarer than gold, true quiet. The trapline began a quarter-mile from the cabin, following an old game trail that wound through stands of aspen and pine. Red had placed his sets with the patience of a chess master, reading the landscape like scripture. 47 traps in all, each one checked every third day, whether the weather cooperated or not. It was honest work, requiring skill and respect for the animals that provided his meager income. The pelts brought enough to buy supplies in the valley town of Durango: flour, coffee, ammunition, and the occasional book. Scout trotted ahead, nose to the ground, following scents that told stories Red could only imagine. The dog had learned the routine years ago, knew which traps might hold a prize and which were likely empty. His tail wagged slightly as they approached the first set, placed beside a fallen log where pine martens liked to travel. The trap held nothing but disturbed snow, but Red wasn't disappointed. The mountains operated on their own schedule, not his needs. He reset the trigger mechanism with practiced movements, his breath forming small clouds in the crisp air. The temperature hovered near 10 degrees, cold enough to preserve any catch but not so bitter that working with his hands became torture. They moved through the woods like ghosts, Red's boots finding the quiet spots between branches, while Scout flowed around obstacles with liquid grace. This was the part of his day Red treasured most, the seamless partnership between man and dog, the careful reading of sign and weather, the deep satisfaction of moving through wild country with skill earned through experience. At the 7th trap, Scout's behavior changed. His ears pricked forward, and he lifted his head, testing the wind with flared nostrils. Red froze, following the dog's gaze toward the eastern ridgeline. In 15 years, Scout had never been wrong about danger. "What is it, boy?" Red whispered, though his own senses were already sharpening, falling back into patterns learned in Southeast Asian jungles. The wind carried something foreign, not the clean scent of snow and pine, but something mechanical, out of place. They climbed toward the ridge, moving more carefully now. Red's hand drifted unconsciously to the .36 slung across his shoulder, a gesture he hadn't made in years. Scout stayed close, his body language tense and alert. The eastern slope offered a view of country Red rarely visited. Too exposed, too far from the cabin, and the hunting wasn't as good. But as they crested the ridge, both man and dog stopped short. A thin column of smoke rose from the valley below, barely visible against the grey sky. Someone had a fire going down there, and that someone wasn't supposed to exist. Red pulled a small pair of binoculars from his pack, military surplus like most of his gear. Through the lenses, he could make out a structure that had no business being in this wilderness, a large building, maybe 3 stories, constructed of red brick that stood out like a wound against the white landscape. Even from this distance, he could see it was substantial, expensive, completely inappropriate for mountain country. "What the hell?" he breathed, lowering the binoculars. Scout whined softly, sharing his master's unease. Red had lived in these mountains long enough to know every cabin, every hunting shack, every structure within 20 miles of his place. The Forest Service maintained detailed maps, and he'd studied them all. Nothing like this building appeared on any official record, which meant either someone had built it illegally or they'd built it quietly. And in Red's experience, people who built quietly usually had something to hide. The smart thing would be to turn around, check the rest of his traps, and forget what he'd seen. Red had spent 15 years avoiding other people's troubles, and it had served him well. But as he watched the smoke rising from that impossible building, he felt something stirring in his chest that he'd thought was dead. Curiosity, maybe, or the old soldier's instinct that said when something didn't belong. It usually meant danger. Scout pressed against his leg. The dog's warmth, a reminder of what mattered. They had a good life up here, a clean life. No need to go borrowing trouble from strangers, but the smoke kept rising, and Red kept watching. And something in the way it curled through the still air told him that trouble might already be borrowed. Whether he wanted it or not, the rest of the trapline yielded 2 pine martens and a fox, all caught clean and quick. Red's movements remained automatic, muscle memory guiding his hands while his mind churned over the mystery building. By the time they returned to the cabin, the sun was high enough to warm the south-facing wall. But Red felt cold in ways that had nothing to do with weather. He spent the afternoon preparing the pelts, work that usually brought him satisfaction. The precise movements of skinning, fleshing, and stretching helped quiet his thoughts. But today, his hands seemed clumsy, and twice he had to stop and take a deep breath to steady himself. Scout lay by the fire, but even the old dog seemed restless. His ears swiveled toward the east window every few minutes, as if listening for sounds that never came. As darkness settled over the mountains, Red sat at his small table with a cup of coffee and his journal open before him. For the first time in months, he wrote more than weather observations. November 15th, temperature holding steady around 10 degrees. Wind light from the northwest. Scout and I discovered a large structure approximately 8 miles east-northeast of the cabin. 3 stories, brick construction, appears new, but no record of permits or construction activity. Smoke visible from chimney. No vehicle access apparent from our vantage point. We'll monitor situation. He paused, pencil hovering over the page. Then he added, something doesn't feel right about this. Outside, the wind picked up, rattling the cabin's shutters and sending snow devils dancing across the clearing. Red closed the journal and banked the fire, but sleep came slow that night. And when it finally arrived, it brought dreams of another jungle, another time, when ignoring his instincts had cost him more than he could bear to remember. 3 days passed before Red saw the elk. He tried to put the mansion out of his mind, focusing on the familiar rhythms of mountain life. The weather had turned colder, dropping another 6 inches of snow that muffled sound and made tracking easier. Red worked his trapline with mechanical precision, but Scout seemed to sense his distraction. The dog stayed closer than usual, amber eyes watchful and concerned. On the morning of the 4th day, they were checking the northern sets when Scout's head snapped up, ears rigid with attention. Red followed his gaze and saw movement through the trees. A large bull elk picking its way carefully through the timber, favoring its left front leg. Red pulled out his binoculars and studied the animal. The elk was magnificent. Probably 600 pounds, with a rack that would score well into the record books. But something was wrong with its movement. The limp was pronounced and dark stains marked the snow where it had passed. Blood trail, Red murmured to Scout. Poor bastard's been shot. It wasn't uncommon for wounded animals to escape hunters, especially during rifle season, when weekend warriors crowded the accessible areas. But rifle season had ended 2 weeks ago. And Red was certain no one had permission to hunt this high in the wilderness area. The elk struggled forward another 50 yards before stopping, head hanging low with exhaustion. Red could see the wound now, a gaping hole in the animal's shoulder that spoke of a large caliber rifle fired at close range. Not a hunting shot. A hunting shot would have dropped the elk clean or missed entirely. This was the work of someone who either didn't know how to shoot or didn't care about a clean kill. Easy, boy, Red whispered as Scout whined softly. The dog understood suffering even in wild things. Red faced a choice. The humane thing would be to put the elk out of its misery with a single shot from his .30-06. But a gunshot would echo through these mountains. And with that strange mansion somewhere to the east, Red wasn't sure he wanted to announce his presence. The elk made the decision for him. It stumbled, caught itself, and then continued east, leaving a trail of blood drops dark against the fresh snow. Toward the mansion. Damn, Red breathed. The animal was heading directly toward whatever operation was running out of that building, and in its condition, it wouldn't survive much longer. If he was going to help it, he needed to act soon. Red checked his rifle and started following the blood trail, Scout padding silently beside him. They moved carefully, using every bit of cover the terrain offered. The elk's path meandered through stands of aspen and across small clearings, always trending east and downhill. After an hour of tracking, Red began to hear sounds that didn't belong in the wilderness. Machinery humming, vehicles moving, voices carrying on the thin air. He dropped to one knee and pulled out his binoculars, scanning the valley ahead. The mansion sat in a natural depression between 2 ridges, positioned to be invisible from most approaches. 3 stories of red brick and white trim, with smoke rising from multiple chimneys. It looked like something transplanted from an eastern city, completely out of place among the pine and granite of the San Juans. But it wasn't the building that made Red's blood run cold. It was the activity around it. 2 black SUVs were parked near what appeared to be a service entrance. Men in winter clothing moved between the vehicles and the building, their movements purposeful and coordinated. Even from a distance, Red could tell these weren't construction workers or caretakers. These men moved like soldiers, or like the kind of people who made their living in dangerous places. Scout pressed against Red's leg, sensing his tension. Through the binoculars, Red watched as one of the men gestured toward the ridge where they were hidden. For a moment, Red thought they'd been spotted, but then he realized the man was pointing at something else. The wounded elk. The animal had emerged from the tree line and stood swaying in the open meadow below, perhaps 200 yards from the mansion. Even at this distance, Red could see its labored breathing, the way it held its injured leg. One of the men walked to the nearest SUV and pulled out what looked like an assault rifle. He raised it casually as if shooting wounded animals was part of his daily routine. "Son of a bitch," Red whispered. The rifle cracked once, the sound echoing off the surrounding peaks. The elk dropped instantly, its suffering ended by a bullet that had nothing to do with mercy and everything to do with eliminating a problem. Red felt something cold and familiar settle in his stomach, the same feeling he'd had in Vietnam when innocent things died because they'd wandered into the wrong place at the wrong time. He'd sworn he was done with that feeling, done with the kind of men who could end a life without thought or ceremony. The men below paid no more attention to the dead elk than they would to a fallen log. They continued their work, loading boxes from the building into the SUVs with efficient movements that spoke of practice and urgency. Red studied their operation through his binoculars, his military training automatically cataloguing details. 4 men visible, possibly more inside the building. Professional-grade weapons and equipment, vehicles with out-of-state plates. Most telling of all, they were packing up, loading the SUVs as if preparing to abandon the site. Something had spooked them, and Red had a sinking feeling it might be related to the wounded elk's blood trail leading directly to their doorstep. If someone had wounded that animal nearby, it meant people were moving through these mountains, people who might have seen things they weren't supposed to see. As Red watched, a 5th man emerged from the mansion's front entrance. Even at distance, there was something different about him, the way the others deferred to his presence, the careful attention they paid to his gestures. This was the man in charge, and when he pointed toward the ridgeline where Red was hidden, it wasn't casual curiosity. "Time to go," Red whispered to Scout. They backed away from the ridge crest, keeping low until the trees provided cover. Red's mind raced as they retreated toward familiar territory. Whatever was happening at that mansion, it was ending. The men were pulling out, which meant either their business was finished or they'd been compromised. Either way, Red had seen too much. They made it back to the cabin as the sun touched the western peaks. Red's hands shook slightly as he built up the fire, not from cold, but from the familiar rush of adrenaline that came with being in the presence of predators. Scout seemed to sense his master's agitation, staying close and alert. Red sat at his small table and opened his journal, staring at the blank page for a long time before he began to write. November 18th. Followed wounded elk east toward the structure. Multiple armed individuals present, vehicles preparing to depart. Professional operation likely illegal. Animal put down with military-style weapon. Observed loading of materials into 2 black SUVs. Leader figure demonstrated awareness of potential surveillance. Situation suggests imminent departure from area. He paused, then added, "They know someone's out here, outside." Full darkness had settled over the mountains, but Red didn't feel the usual peace that came with nightfall. Somewhere in the valley below, dangerous men were making decisions about what to do with witnesses. And Red was beginning to understand that his 15 years of carefully maintained isolation might be coming to an end. Whether he wanted it or not, Scout lay by the fire. But his ears remained alert, turned toward sounds only he could hear. In the distance, very faint but unmistakable, came the sound of engines starting and vehicles moving through the night. Red checked his rifle and made sure it was loaded. Then he banked the fire and settled into his chair, watching the eastern window and waiting for dawn. Sleep would have to wait. Some nights a man had to choose between rest and staying alive. Tonight was one of those nights. Red didn't sleep that night. He sat in his chair facing the eastern window, rifle across his knees, while Scout dozed fitfully by the dying fire. Every sound from the darkness beyond, wind through pine branches, snow sliding from a roof, the distant call of a great horned owl, made his finger tighten on the trigger guard. Dawn came grey and bitter, with new snow falling in fat flakes that would erase tracks and muffle sound. Red had hoped the weather might provide cover, but as he watched the storm develop, he realized it worked both ways. If he couldn't hear them coming, they couldn't hear him moving. He spent the morning preparing for trouble he hoped wouldn't arrive. The cabin had been built with defense in mind, though Red had told himself it was just good mountain construction. The walls were thick log, the windows small, and positioned to provide clear fields of fire. He'd stockpiled ammunition, food, and medical supplies without ever admitting why. Now those preparations seemed less like paranoia and more like wisdom. Scout paced restlessly, pausing every few minutes to stare toward the eastern wall. The dog's anxiety fed Red's own growing certainty that something was coming. In Vietnam, he'd learned to trust his gut, and right now his gut was screaming that the danger was real and getting closer. Around noon, Scout's head snapped up and he issued a low growl that raised the hair on Red's neck. Through the snow, Red heard what had alerted the dog, the distant rumble of vehicles laboring up the mountain track that led toward his cabin. Red moved to the eastern window and peered through a gap in the shutters. 2 black SUVs were picking their way up the old logging road, their occupants probably following GPS coordinates rather than any real knowledge of mountain travel. The vehicles moved slowly, stopping frequently as their drivers negotiated obstacles that would have been child's play for someone who knew the country. Amateurs, Red muttered. But his relief was short-lived. Immature or not, they'd found him, which meant they had resources and determination. Red grabbed his rifle and moved to the back of the cabin, where a small window offered a view of the approach route. Scout followed, staying low and quiet as he'd been trained years ago by circumstances Red preferred not to remember. The SUVs stopped about a quarter-mile from the cabin, just out of rifle range, smart, through his binoculars. Red watched as 4 men climbed out and began unloading equipment. They moved with military precision, checking weapons and adjusting gear with the efficiency of a professional team. The leader was the same man Red had seen directing operations at the mansion, tall, lean, with the kind of confidence that came from giving orders and having them followed without question. He studied the cabin through his own binoculars, while his men spread out in a textbook flanking pattern. Red felt his old training kick in, muscle memory from a war fought in different terrain but with similar stakes. These men weren't here to talk. They were here to eliminate a problem, and Red had become that problem by witnessing something he wasn't supposed to see. Scout whined softly, sensing the tension radiating from his master. Red reached down and scratched the dog's ears, a gesture that had become habit over the years. "Easy, boy," he whispered. "We've been in worse spots than this." That was a lie. In Vietnam, Red had been young and angry and backed up by the most powerful military in the world. Now he was 62 years old with arthritic hands and a 15-year-old dog for backup. But he also had 15 years of mountain experience and the kind of desperate clarity that came with having nothing left to lose. The leader raised his hand and made a gesture that sent 2 of his men circling toward the north side of the cabin, while the others stayed with the vehicles. A classic pincer movement designed to eliminate escape routes and force surrender. Red moved to his gun cabinet and pulled out a box of 30-06 rounds, loading his rifle with the deliberate care of a man who couldn't afford to waste ammunition. 5 shots in the magazine, 1 in the chamber. 6 chances to even the odds. The men were taking their time, moving carefully through terrain they didn't know. That gave Red a few minutes to consider his options, and none of them were good. He could try to slip out the back and fade into the mountains, but Scout was too old for that kind of travel in winter conditions. He could try to negotiate, but men who shot wounded elk for convenience weren't likely to be reasonable about witnesses. That left fighting, and Red was surprised to discover he wasn't afraid of that prospect. Angry, yes. Disappointed that his peaceful life was ending this way. But not afraid. Fear was for people who had something to lose. And Red had already lost everything that mattered, except for the dog beside him and the patch of mountain he'd called home. A shadow moved past the north window, one of the flankers getting into position. Red tracked the movement with his rifle barrel, finger on the trigger, waiting for a clear shot. The man was good, using available cover and moving with patience. But he was operating in Red's backyard now. Red's radio crackled, an old emergency frequency that saw little use, but which he monitored out of habit. The voice that came through was professional, controlled. "Mountain Man, this is Cascade Leader. We need to have a conversation." Red didn't respond. In his experience, people who opened negotiations with flanking maneuvers weren't interested in conversation. "Mountain Man, we know you're listening. We have a proposition that might interest you. We're prepared to offer compensation for your discretion regarding recent events in the area." Still, Red remained silent. Scout had moved to the front window and was staring intently at something Red couldn't see. The dog's body language suggested someone was moving into position on that side as well. "Mountain Man, we're going to approach under a white flag. No weapons visible. We just want to talk." Through the front window, Red saw the leader walking slowly toward the cabin, hands empty and visible. He looked calm, confident, like a man making a business call rather than approaching an armed position. Behind him, his men had disappeared into cover positions that probably gave them clear shots at every window and door. Red had seen this dance before. The reasonable approach, the offer of money, the suggestion that everyone could walk away happy. Right up until the moment when walking away wasn't an option anymore. The leader stopped about 50 yards from the cabin and called out, "My name is Marcus Vega. I represent certain business interests that value privacy. I believe we may have encountered a misunderstanding regarding your recent observations." Red smiled grimly. A misunderstanding? As if accidentally witnessing a criminal operation was just a case of being in the wrong place at the wrong time. "Mr. Mallory, yes, we know who you are. I'm prepared to offer you $25,000 for your continued residence in this beautiful area and your natural discretion about things that don't concern you." $25,000. More money than Red saw in 3 years of trapping. Enough to improve the cabin, stock up on supplies, maybe even buy Scout some company in his old age. It was a good offer, too good, which meant they had no intention of honoring it. Red chambered around and settled his rifle against the window frame. Outside, Vega stood waiting for an answer, looking like a man who'd never had anyone refuse his generosity. He was about to learn something new about mountain hospitality. Red's answer came in the form of a .30-06 round that took Marcus Vega in the upper chest and spun him like a child's top. The man dropped into the snow, his confident demeanor replaced by the ugly reality of a sucking chest wound. The mountains erupted in gunfire. Red rolled away from the window as automatic weapons chewed through the cabin's log walls, splinters and bark flying in deadly clouds. Scout yelped and scrambled toward the back of the cabin, his old body moving with surprising agility, born of pure survival instinct. "Sorry about the noise." "Boy," Red muttered, working the bolt on his rifle and chambering another round. He'd learned long ago that once shooting started, the only way out was through. The gunfire stopped abruptly, leaving an echoing silence that was somehow more ominous than the noise had been. Red counted muzzle flashes in his mind. 3 positions, maybe 4. Vega's men had good discipline, but they were operating in unfamiliar terrain against someone who knew every board and beam of his defensive position. A voice called out from the trees, "You just made a serious mistake, old man." Marcus was the reasonable one. "Now you deal with us," Red smiled grimly. They thought age meant weakness, that 15 years in the mountains had made him soft. They were about to learn the difference between getting older and getting obsolete. He crawled to the eastern window and peered through a bullet hole in the shutter. Vega lay motionless in the snow, dark blood spreading around his body like spilled paint. 1 down, 3 to go. The odds were still terrible, but they were better than they'd been 5 minutes ago. Scout had positioned himself by the back door, ember eyes alert and ears pricked toward sounds Red's aging hearing might miss. The dog's loyalty was absolute, but Red wished he could send him away from this place. Scout deserved better than to die, because his master had stumbled into the wrong kind of trouble. A shadow moved past the north window. Red tracked it with his rifle barrel, waiting for a clear shot. These men were professionals, but they were used to urban operations, where backup was minutes away and escape routes were plentiful. Here in the mountains, there was nowhere to run and no one coming to help. The radio crackled again. "This is Cascade 2. Cascade Leader is down." "Repeat, Cascade Leader is KIA. Copy 2, switch to Bravo protocols." No prisoners. Red had expected as much. The pretense of negotiation was over, replaced by the brutal arithmetic of eliminating witnesses. But the radio chatter told him something useful. These men were part of a larger organization with established procedures and call signs. This wasn't some random criminal enterprise. This was professional. A movement at the edge of his vision made Red swing the rifle toward the south window. A man in winter camouflage was working his way closer, using a fallen log for cover. Good technique, but he didn't know about the clear field of fire Red had deliberately maintained when he built the cabin. Red led the target slightly and squeezed the trigger. The 30-06 boomed again, and the man pitched forward into the snow. 2 down, the response was immediate and overwhelming. Both remaining gunmen opened up with everything they had, raking the cabin with sustained automatic fire that turned the air inside thick with wood dust and flying debris. Red pressed himself against the floor as bullets punched through walls that had seemed so solid when he built them. Scout whimpered and crawled toward Red, seeking comfort from the only family he'd ever known. Red reached out and pulled the dog close, feeling the animal's heart hammering against his ribs. "Easy, boy," he whispered. "We're not done yet." The firing stopped again, and Red heard boots crunching through snow. They were moving, probably trying to flank the cabin, now that their numbers were reduced. 2 men with automatic weapons were still more than enough to finish this fight if they played it smart. Red reloaded his rifle with practiced movements. Muscle memory from countless training exercises and a few real firefights, he preferred not to remember. 4 rounds left in the box, plus whatever he could scavenge from his emergency cache if he lived long enough to reach it. The radio chattered. "Cascade 3, take the rear exit. I'll push from the front. Copy. Moving now." Red smiled without humor. They were still using radio discipline, which meant they hadn't fully grasped their situation. In urban combat, radio coordination was essential. In mountain fighting, it just told your enemy exactly what you were planning. He moved to the back window and saw Cascade 3 working his way toward the rear of the cabin, assault rifle ready and eyes scanning for targets. The man was competent but cautious, probably wondering how an old mountain hermit had managed to kill 2 professionals in less than 10 minutes. Red lined up his shot and waited. Patience was the mountain hunter's greatest weapon, and he'd learned patience from 15 years of reading weather patterns and animal behavior. When Cascade 3 stepped into the open space behind the cabin, Red was ready. The 3rd shot took the man center mass, spinning him around and dropping him into the snow beside the woodpile Red had split just that morning. 3 down, 1 to go, but the last man was the smart one, the careful one who'd let his partners take the risks while he observed and learned. Red could feel him out there, studying the cabin and planning his approach with the patience of a professional killer. Scout's ears swiveled toward the front of the cabin, and Red heard what had alerted the dog, the subtle sound of someone moving very carefully through the snow. Cascade 4 was making his play. Red crawled to the front window and peered through another bullet hole. At first he saw nothing, just snow and trees and the motionless form of Marcus Vega. Then movement caught his eye, a flash of dark clothing against white snow. There and gone so quickly he might have imagined it. The man was good, better than his dead companions, more patient and methodical. He was working his way closer with the skill of someone who'd done this before and lived to learn from his mistakes. Red checked his rifle, 2 rounds left in the magazine, plus the emergency box hidden under his cot. Enough to finish this, if he didn't waste shots on shadows and possibilities. Scout suddenly stiffened and turned toward the eastern wall. Red followed the dog's gaze and saw what had alarmed him. A thin tendril of smoke seeping through a gap in the logs. The bastard was trying to burn him out. Red felt a familiar coldness settle in his chest. The same feeling he'd had in Vietnam when the situation went from bad to desperate. But desperation could be a weapon too, if a man knew how to use it. He grabbed his rifle and the emergency ammunition box, then looked down at Scout. "Time to go hunting, old boy," he whispered. One more time. The smoke was getting thicker, seeping through the cabin's log walls with malicious persistence. Red could smell the accelerant, probably gasoline or camp fuel, mixed with the honest scent of burning pine. Cascade 4 wasn't taking any chances. He meant to cook Red alive if bullets wouldn't do the job. Red grabbed his emergency pack from under the cot, a carefully assembled collection of survival gear he'd hoped never to use. 15 years of mountain living had taught him that preparation was the difference between life and death. And right now, that lesson was about to be tested in the most brutal way possible. Scout stayed close as Red moved to the rear door. The dog's trust absolute, despite the chaos erupting around them. Red wished he could explain to Scout that what came next was going to be dangerous. That the safe world they'd built together was ending whether they survived or not. "Okay. Boy," Red whispered, checking his rifle one more time. "We're going outside. Stay low, stay quiet, and follow my lead." He cracked the rear door and peered out into the grey afternoon. Snow was falling harder now, fat flakes that would provide some concealment, but also muffle the sounds that might warn him of approaching danger. The body of Cascade 3 lay crumpled beside the woodpile, assault rifle fallen from nerveless fingers. Red slipped outside, moving with the fluid silence that had kept him alive in Vietnamese jungles. Scout followed, his old legs carrying him with surprising grace through snow that came up to his belly. Together they worked their way around the north side of the cabin, using the building's bulk to shield them from wherever Cascade 4 had positioned himself. The smell of smoke was stronger here, and Red could see orange flames beginning to lick at the cabin's eastern wall. Whoever was left had done his work well. The fire was positioned to spread quickly through the dry logs, turning Red's sanctuary into a furnace. Red felt a familiar anger building in his chest, the cold rage that had sustained him through 3 tours of combat. This place had been his peace, his redemption from the violence that had nearly destroyed him. Now these men were burning it down because he'd seen something he wasn't supposed to see. Through the falling snow, Red caught a glimpse of movement near the tree line. Cascade 4 was repositioning, probably trying to get an angle on the rear door in case Red tried to escape the burning cabin. The man was patient and methodical, characteristics that made him dangerous, but also predictable. Red worked his way through the timber, using terrain he knew like his own heartbeat. Every tree, every boulder, every depression in the ground was familiar territory. He'd walked these woods in every season, in every kind of weather for 15 years. Now that knowledge was the only advantage he had against a younger man with better weapons and professional training. Scout stayed close, moving with the instinctive silence of a creature that had spent its life in wild country. The dog's senses were sharper than Red's, and twice Scout's sudden alertness warned Red to freeze as sound or scent carried information only the animal could process. They'd covered maybe 100 yards when Red spotted him. Cascade 4 was crouched behind a fallen pine about 60 yards from the burning cabin, assault rifle trained on the rear door. He was good, positioned for a clear shot while remaining concealed from anyone trying to escape the flames, but he'd made one mistake. He was focused on the cabin, waiting for Red to come to him instead of considering that the old mountain man might turn hunter. Red settled into a prone position behind a granite boulder, using its bulk to steady his rifle. The range was longer than he liked, and the falling snow would affect bullet trajectory. But he'd made harder shots tracking elk through these same mountains. Scout pressed against his side, warm and reassuring. Red reached down and scratched the dog's ears one more time, then settled the rifle's crosshairs on his target. Cascade 4 shifted slightly, adjusting his position for a better view of the cabin. The movement exposed his profile for just a moment, shoulder, head, and part of his torso visible above the fallen log. Red took a deep breath, released half of it, and squeezed the trigger. The 3006 cracked across the valley, its sound echoing off the surrounding peaks. Cascade 4 pitched backward into the snow and lay still. 4 down, none to go. Red remained in position for long minutes, scanning the area for any sign of additional threats. The radio chatter had mentioned 4 men, but there was always the possibility of backup or overwatch elements he hadn't detected. In Vietnam, he'd learned that the enemy you didn't see was usually the one who killed you. But the mountains remained quiet, except for the crackling of flames consuming his cabin. No additional gunfire, no movement in the timber, no radio traffic on the emergency frequency. It seemed the immediate threat was over. Red stood slowly, his joints protesting after the long minutes prone in the snow. Scout wagged his tail once, as if congratulating his master on a successful hunt. Together, they walked toward the cabin, or what was left of it. The fire had taken hold with vicious efficiency. Flames were already eating through the roof, and smoke poured from every opening. 15 years of carefully accumulated possessions, books, clothes, tools, memories, were being reduced to ash and cinders. Red watched his home burn and felt something break inside his chest. Not despair exactly, but a profound weariness. He was too old for this kind of excitement, too tired of violence and running and starting over. He'd built this life deliberately, chosen this isolation specifically to avoid the kind of men who solve problems with guns and fire. But the world had found him anyway. Scout whined softly and pressed against Red's leg. Offering what comfort an old dog could provide, Red reached down and scratched behind the animal's ears, drawing strength from the simple contact. "Well, boy," he said quietly, "it looks like we're homeless again." The emergency pack on his shoulders contained enough supplies for maybe a week in the mountains, assuming the weather didn't turn worse. After that, he'd need to make some hard decisions about what came next, but first he needed to understand what he'd stumbled into. For professional killers didn't appear in remote wilderness areas without good reason, and that mansion didn't exist without purpose. Whatever operation had been running out of that building, it was important enough to kill 4, important enough that more people might come looking when these 4 failed to report in. Red shouldered his rifle and started walking east, toward the valley, where the mansion sat like a cancer among the clean peaks. Scout followed without question, trust absolute despite the uncertainty ahead. Behind them, the cabin collapsed in a shower of sparks and burning timber, taking with it the last remnants of the peaceful life Red had spent 15 years building. Ahead lay only questions, danger, and the kind of trouble that followed a man long after the shooting stopped. The mansion loomed against the darkening sky like something from a fever dream, its red brick walls incongruous among the snow-laden pines. Red approached from the north, moving carefully through timber that provided concealment while he studied the building and its surroundings. From his position on the ridge, he could see the entire compound. The main structure was even more impressive up close. 3 full stories with elaborate stonework around the windows and doors, built with the kind of attention to detail that cost serious money. Attached to the rear was a smaller outbuilding that might have served as servants' quarters or staff housing. Both black SUVs were gone, along with any sign of the men who'd been loading them the day before. The mansion appeared completely abandoned, but Red had lived long enough to know that appearances could be deadlier than bullets. Scout pressed against his leg, the dog's anxiety evident in his tense posture and pricked ears. The old animal sensed something wrong about this place, something that went beyond the recent violence and spoke to deeper corruptions. Red settled behind a boulder and studied the building through his binoculars as afternoon faded into evening. No lights appeared in any of the windows. No smoke rose from the chimneys. No movement disturbed the snow around the entrances. If anyone remained inside, they were being very careful about revealing their presence. But someone had built this place, furnished it, and used it for purposes important enough to kill witnesses. That someone might return, and when they did, Red wanted to understand what he was dealing with. As full darkness settled over the valley, Red made his decision. Scout would have to stay behind. The dog's breathing was too loud for stealth work, and Red couldn't risk losing the only family he had left to whatever dangers might lurk inside those brick walls. "Stay here." "Boy," he whispered, scratching Scout's ears. "Guard our gear. I'll be back." Scout whined softly, but settled into the hollow beside the boulder, understanding that his job was to wait and watch. The dog's amber eyes followed Red as he moved down the slope toward the mansion, rifle ready and senses alert for any sign of trouble. The front door stood slightly ajar, darkness beyond revealing nothing of the interior. Red paused at the threshold, listening for sounds that might indicate occupancy. Nothing but the whisper of wind through empty rooms and the settling groans of a large building adjusting to changing temperatures. He slipped inside, his flashlight revealing an interior that belonged in some eastern city rather than Colorado wilderness. Hardwood floors gleamed under layers of dust. Oil paintings in elaborate frames lined the walls. A crystal chandelier hung from a coffered ceiling that spoke of craftsmen imported from far away. But underneath the grandeur, Red detected signs of hasty departure. Papers scattered across a mahogany desk in what appeared to be a study. Chairs overturned in a dining room designed to seat 20. Boxes half-packed and then abandoned, their contents spilling across expensive carpets. Red moved through the ground floor methodically, his military training guiding him through the systematic search of an abandoned position. The kitchen held industrial-grade equipment and enough dry goods to feed a small army. A communications room contained radio equipment more sophisticated than anything Red had seen outside of military installations. Most telling was the basement. Steel doors led to rooms that had obviously been used for storage, but storage of what remained unclear. Heavy gouges in the concrete floor suggested machinery or equipment had been moved recently and with considerable urgency. The air held lingering chemical odors that made Red's nose burn and reminded him of things he'd rather forget. On the second floor, Red found what appeared to be living quarters, a dozen small rooms furnished with basic beds and dressers, Spartan accommodations for people who weren't expected to stay long or live comfortably. The windows had been barred from the inside, and heavy locks on the doors suggested the occupants hadn't been guests in any conventional sense. It was on the third floor that Red found the room that changed everything. The door was reinforced steel painted to look like wood, secured with locks that belonged on a bank vault rather than a bedroom. Someone had worked hard to get inside. The metal around the lock mechanism showed fresh scratches, and the frame bore marks from pry bars or similar tools. Inside, Red's flashlight revealed a child's room. Not the Spartan accommodations of the second floor, but a space designed for someone's comfort. Toys scattered across the floor, children's books in both English and Spanish. A small bed with rumpled sheets that suggested recent occupancy, but it was the drawings that made Red's blood run cold. Crayon sketches taped to the walls showed scenes no child should witness: men with guns, buildings on fire, people running and falling and lying still. One drawing showed a small figure hiding in a closet while dark shapes moved outside. Red studied the artwork with growing unease. Someone very young had been kept in this room. Someone who'd witnessed violence and drawn what they'd seen with the brutal honesty that only children possessed. The recent disturbance suggested that child had been here when the mansion was abandoned, possibly taken during the hasty evacuation. A sound from outside made Red freeze, the distant rumble of vehicles approaching. Through the third-floor window, he could see headlights winding up the mountain road, still distant but getting closer. Red clicked off his flashlight and moved to the window. 3 vehicles this time, larger than the SUVs, moving with the confidence of people who belonged here. The cleanup crew, most likely, coming to eliminate evidence and tie up loose ends, including any witnesses who might still be lurking in the area. Red made his way quickly back to the ground floor, moving by feel and memory through rooms he'd just mapped. The sound of engines grew louder as the vehicles approached the mansion. Soon, there would be men with lights and weapons sweeping through these rooms, and Red had no desire to be caught inside when they arrived. He slipped out the rear door and worked his way back up the slope toward where Scout waited. The dog greeted him with silent enthusiasm, tail wagging, despite the tension that radiated from both of them. "We've got company coming," Red whispered, settling beside the boulder. "Big company." Through his binoculars, he watched as the vehicles pulled up to the mansion, 2 cargo trucks, and what looked like a military surplus personnel carrier. Men poured out and began unloading equipment with the efficiency of a professional operation, but these weren't the same kind of men who'd attacked his cabin. These wore coveralls and carried cleaning equipment rather than assault rifles. A disposal team sent to erase any trace of whatever had been happening in that mansion. Red counted at least 8 men, maybe more. Too many to fight, even if fighting would accomplish anything. But as he watched them work, Red realized he was looking at something bigger than a simple criminal enterprise. The resources required to build and operate a facility like this, the professional security teams, the cleanup crews, this was organizational crime on a scale that dwarfed anything he'd encountered. And somewhere in the middle of it was a child who'd drawn pictures of violence and been taken away in the night. Red settled back against the boulder and prepared for a long watch. Whatever these men were cleaning up, he needed to understand it, because something told him this wasn't over, that the 4 dead men around his burned cabin were just the beginning of a much larger and more dangerous game, a game that now included him. Whether he wanted to play or not, Red had been watching the cleanup operation for 3 hours when Scout's ears suddenly pricked toward the northwest, away from the mansion and the busy men erasing evidence. The dog's body language was different this time, not the alert tension of detecting threats, but something softer, more curious. Red followed Scout's gaze and saw nothing but snow-laden trees and deepening shadows. But the dog's senses were sharper than his own, and Scout had never been wrong about important things. Red pulled out his binoculars and scanned the tree line systematically. At first, he saw only wilderness, pine branches heavy with snow, the dark shapes of boulders, the natural chaos of mountain forest. Then movement caught his eye, so small and tentative he almost missed it. A flash of bright color among the whites and grays of winter landscape. Red adjusted his focus and felt his heart stop. A child was moving through the trees, perhaps 200 yards from their position. Small, maybe 7 or 8 years old, wearing what looked like a red winter coat that stood out like a beacon against the snow. The child moved with the careful, frightened steps of someone trying to stay hidden while having no real understanding of how to do it. "Jesus," Red breathed. The child from the mansion, somehow escaped or left behind in the hasty evacuation. Alone in mountain wilderness, with night falling and temperatures already dropping below freezing. Scout whined softly, his instincts recognizing vulnerability even at this distance. The dog looked up at Red with questioning eyes, as if asking what they were going to do about this small creature lost in the killing cold. Red studied the situation through his binoculars, his mind racing through possibilities and dangers. The cleanup crew was still working at the mansion, their lights and activity making the building look like a construction site. They'd have sentries posted, probably motion detectors or other security measures. Getting to the child would mean exposing himself to discovery. But leaving the child alone meant certain death. No 7-year-old could survive a mountain night in these conditions, especially one who'd clearly been kept indoors and pampered until recently. The red coat was expensive, but designed for city winters, not high-altitude survival. The child stumbled and fell, struggling back to feet that must be numb with cold. Even at this distance, Red could see exhaustion in every movement. How long had the child been wandering? Since the evacuation yesterday. Since this morning. Red made his decision with the certainty that came from having no real choice. He'd spent 15 years running from the kind of situations that required him to risk everything for strangers. But some lines couldn't be crossed. Some responsibilities couldn't be avoided. Not when a child was dying alone in the snow. "Stay here, boy," he whispered to Scout. "Guard our gear. I'll be back with company." Red left his rifle with Scout. It would only slow him down, and if things went wrong, firepower wouldn't save him anyway. He kept his sidearm, a .45 automatic that had served him well in Vietnam. and started working his way around the valley toward where he'd last seen the child. Moving through mountain timber at night required patience and skill that Red had developed over decades of hunting and trapping. Every step had to be tested, every shadow evaluated for concealment. The cleanup crew's lights helped by destroying their night vision while illuminating his route. But those same lights meant discovery would be immediate and probably fatal. It took him 40 minutes to cover the quarter-mile to where he'd spotted the child. By then, full darkness had settled over the mountains, and the temperature was dropping fast. Red's breath came in visible puffs, and ice was already forming on his beard. He found the child huddled against the base of a large pine tree, small arms wrapped around drawn-up knees, shivering so hard that the red coat seemed to vibrate. Dark hair framed a face that was pale with cold and exhaustion. A girl, Red realized, maybe 8 years old, with eyes that held too much knowledge for someone so young. She looked up when Red approached, and he saw recognition flicker across her features, not of him specifically, but of the type of man he represented: adult, male, dangerous. She tried to scramble away, but her legs were too cold and weak to carry her. "Easy, little one," Red said softly, keeping his voice low and calm. "I'm not going to hurt you. My name is Red." The girl stared at him with eyes that had seen too much, deciding whether this new threat was worse than freezing to death alone. She was beyond speech, hypothermia stealing her ability to communicate. But her gaze held a desperate intelligence that told Red she understood the choice she faced. Red pulled off his heavy winter coat and wrapped it around the small figure, feeling how thin she was beneath the expensive but inadequate clothing someone had dressed her in. City clothes for mountain conditions, whoever had been caring for her had never intended for her to survive in wilderness. "Can you walk?" he asked gently. She tried to stand and immediately collapsed back against the tree, her legs unable to support even her small weight. Hypothermia and exhaustion had pushed her beyond the point where willpower could overcome physical limitations. Red gathered the child in his arms, surprised by how light she was, how fragile. She didn't resist, either because she trusted him or because she no longer had the strength to fight. Her breathing was shallow and rapid, her skin cold to the touch despite the layers of clothing. The return journey became a nightmare of careful movement and growing urgency. The girl was slipping deeper into hypothermia with each passing minute, her breathing becoming more labored, her body temperature dropping toward the point of no return. Red had seen hypothermia before, knew the signs that preceded organ failure and death. Halfway back to Scout's position, the girl began to mumble, words in Spanish mixed with English, fragments of sentences that told a story Red didn't want to hear. Names of people who weren't coming back, descriptions of places where bad things happened. The confused testimony of a child who'd witnessed horrors no one should have to see. "Papa," she whispered, the word barely audible. "Papa, ¿dónde estás?" Red's chest tightened. Somewhere this child had a father who was probably dead or worse. Someone who'd tried to protect her and failed, leaving her alone in a world that saw children as commodities to be traded or eliminated. Scout appeared out of the darkness as Red approached their position, the dog's tail wagging with relief at his master's return. But Scout's attention immediately shifted to the small bundle in Red's arms. His instincts recognizing someone who needed protection, Red settled against the boulder and pulled his emergency sleeping bag from his pack, wrapping the girl in its warmth while keeping her close to his body heat. Her breathing was still shallow, but her shivering had stopped, either a good sign or a very bad one. "What's your name, little one?" he asked softly. "Maria," she whispered so quietly he almost missed it. Then stronger, "Maria Elena Vasquez." Red felt something cold settle in his stomach. Vasquez. He'd heard that name before, read it in intelligence briefings during his military service. The Vasquez Cartel, one of the most powerful and ruthless organizations in Mexico. If this child was connected to that family, if she was a daughter or granddaughter of cartel leadership, then the mansion made perfect sense, a safe house. a place to keep valuable assets or hostages away from the violence that surrounded cartel operations. And if Maria Elena Vasquez was here, if she'd been hidden in these mountains, then someone very dangerous was going to come looking for her. Red looked down at the small face pressed against his chest, at the trust this child was placing in a stranger who'd emerged from the darkness. She was maybe 8 years old, innocent of whatever crimes her family might have committed, guilty of nothing but being born into the wrong world. But she was also the key to understanding what had happened here, and possibly the reason why 4 men had died trying to eliminate witnesses. Maria Elena Vasquez wasn't just a lost child. She was evidence of something much larger and more dangerous than Red had imagined. Scout pressed against them both, sharing his warmth and offering what comfort an old dog could provide. In the distance, lights still blazed at the mansion as the cleanup crew continued their work, erasing all traces of whatever operation had been conducted there. Red pulled his radio from his pack and tuned to the emergency frequency, knowing he was about to cross a line from which there might be no return. But some decisions were made by circumstances rather than choice, and a child's life trumped his own desire for continued anonymity. The girl stirred in his arms and looked up at him with eyes that held questions he couldn't answer, and trust he wasn't sure he deserved. "It's going to be okay, Maria," he said softly. "I'm going to get you somewhere safe." It was a promise he wasn't sure he could keep, but it was the only one that mattered now. Red carried Maria Elena through the darkness toward the only shelter he could think of, an old mining cabin tucked into a canyon about 2 miles northwest of the mansion. He'd discovered it during his second winter in the mountains, a relic from the 1890s silver boom that had somehow survived a century of weather and neglect. Over the years, he'd quietly maintained it as an emergency shelter, stocking it with basic supplies and keeping the roof sound. Maria had stopped shivering, which worried Red more than the earlier trembling. Her breathing remained shallow, and she'd lapsed into a semi-conscious state that spoke of severe hypothermia. Every few minutes she would mumble something in Spanish, fragments about her papa, about men with guns, about being scared and cold and wanting to go home. Scout ranged ahead, his nose working to ensure their route remained clear of threats. The old dog seemed to understand the urgency of their situation, moving with purpose through terrain that would challenge men half Red's age. The mining cabin appeared through the snow like a ghost from another era, weathered logs and a tin roof that had seen better decades, but solid enough to provide shelter from the killing cold. Red had reinforced the door and windows years ago, installed a small wood stove, and cached emergency supplies in a hidden compartment beneath the floorboards. Inside, Red worked quickly to build a fire while keeping Maria wrapped in his sleeping bag. The cabin was small, maybe 12 feet square, but it would hold heat once the stove got going. Scout settled immediately by the door, taking up his traditional guard position without being asked. As warmth began to fill the small space, Maria's conditions started to improve. Her breathing deepened and color returned to her pale cheeks. She opened her eyes and looked around with the careful attention of someone who'd learned not to trust new places. "Where are we?" she asked in accented but clear English. "Somewhere safe," Red replied, stirring a pot of soup over the wood stove. "At least for now." Maria struggled to sit up, her small hands clutching the sleeping bag around her shoulders. "The bad men, are they coming?" Red considered lying, offering false comfort, but something in the child's eyes told him she'd had enough of adult deceptions. "I don't know," he said honestly, "but if they do, we'll be ready." She nodded gravely, as if this were exactly the answer she'd expected. "Papa always said the bad men come eventually. He said that's why we had to be strong." "Tell me about your papa," Red said gently, ladling soup into a metal cup. Maria's face brightened for the first time since he'd found her. "Papa is the strongest man in the world. He has big hands and he smells like cigars, and he tells me stories about when he was little in Guadalajara." Her expression darkened. "But the other men don't like Papa. They say he's too soft, that he cares too much about familia." Red handed her the cup of soup. watching as she wrapped her small hands around its warmth. What other men? Tio Miguel and his friends. They came to the house with guns and told Papa he had to choose, La Familia or La Sangre. She sipped the soup carefully. Papa chose Familia. That's why we had to run. Red felt pieces of a larger puzzle clicking into place. Miguel Vasquez. He remembered that name from intelligence briefings. The younger brother, ambitious and ruthless, known for eliminating family members who showed weakness or mercy. If Maria's father had been forced to choose between family loyalty and blood loyalty, it meant a war within the cartel itself. How long were you at the big house? Red asked. Many days. The men said we were safe there, that Papa would come for us when it was time. Her voice grew smaller. But Papa never came. And yesterday, the men got scared about something. They put everything in trucks and forgot about me. Red's jaw tightened. They'd abandoned an 8-year-old child in wilderness conditions because she'd become inconvenient to their escape plans. Professional criminals, but with no more conscience than rabid animals, Maria continued eating her soup while studying Red with curious eyes. Are you a soldier? You move like the men who guarded Papa. I was a soldier once upon a time, Red admitted. Long time ago, in a place far from here, Papa was a soldier too before the Familia business. He showed me his medals. She looked around the small cabin. This is a good hiding place. Very secret, Red smiled despite their circumstances. You think like a soldier yourself, Papa taught me. He said little girls need to be smart to stay safe in a world full of bad men. Her expression grew serious. The men at the big house, they weren't protecting me. They were keeping me like a treasure to trade later. The clarity with which she understood her situation was both impressive and heartbreaking. This child had been forced to grow up fast, to see the world through the harsh lens of cartel politics and family betrayal. Scout's head suddenly lifted, his ears pricked toward the door. Red set down his coffee cup and moved to the window. Peering through a gap in the boards he'd nailed over the glass years ago, lights were moving through the forest. Below, flashlights and what looked like infrared. Searchlights sweeping methodically through the timber. The cleanup crew had finished at the mansion and expanded their operation to include finding whatever had escaped their initial sweep. They're looking for you, Red said quietly. Maria nodded as if this were obvious. Tio Miguel's men. They never stop looking until they find what they want. Red counted at least 6 lights, probably more men behind them. They were moving in a coordinated search pattern, covering ground efficiently but carefully. Professional hunters with good equipment and the patience to do the job right. Do they know about this place? Maria asked. Shouldn't, Red said. But they might find it anyway if they're thorough enough. He moved to the hidden compartment beneath the floorboards and pulled out the supplies he'd cached there. Ammunition, medical kit, emergency rations, and a short-range radio that might reach civilization if atmospheric conditions were right. Maria, he said, I need you to listen carefully. If something happens to me, if the bad men find this place, you take Scout and you run toward that ridge. He pointed through the north window. Follow the ridgeline west until you find a trail marked with orange blazes. That trail leads down to a highway where good people drive trucks and cars. She nodded solemnly. What about you? I'll make sure they don't follow you. Maria was quiet for a moment, studying his face with eyes that seemed too old for her small features. Papa used to talk like that, about protecting Familia no matter what. Your papa sounds like a good man. He is, she said firmly, and someday I'll see him again. Red hoped she was right, but he'd seen enough of cartel politics to know that protection was often temporary and family loyalty could be a fatal weakness. Miguel Vasquez hadn't become a cartel leader by showing mercy to inconvenient relatives. The lights outside were getting closer, their systematic search bringing them steadily up the canyon toward the mining cabin. Red estimated maybe 20 minutes before they reached the area, less if they had thermal imaging equipment. He checked his .45 automatic and the extra magazines in his pack. 16 rounds total. Not much against professional killers with military-grade equipment, but enough to make them pay a price for whatever they found. Scout moved from the door to Maria's side, as if sensing that his protection might soon be needed. The old dog's loyalty was absolute, his courage proven through 15 years of mountain dangers. If it came to fighting, Scout would stand with them until the end. "Maria," Red said, "I want you to know something. Whatever happens tonight, you're safe now. You're not alone anymore." She reached out and took his weathered hand in her small one. "I know," she said simply. "Papa always said I would know when I found the right people to trust." Outside, the lights continued their methodical approach, and Red began making the kind of calculations that had kept him alive, in places where good men died for being in the wrong place at the wrong time. The cabin had one door and two windows, thick log walls that would stop small arms fire, but not heavy weapons. The ridge behind offered escape routes, but only if they could reach it without being detected. The radio crackled with brief transmissions, professional communications that told Red these men were coordinated, disciplined, and accustomed to this kind of work. They weren't just cleaning up evidence anymore. They were hunting. Red moved to the window again and counted lights. 8 now, spread in a search line that would pass within 50 yards of the cabin. Too close to avoid detection, too many to fight effectively. But between him and those lights was a century of mining debris, tailings piles, abandoned equipment, unstable ground that locals knew to avoid. Terrain that could be used to advantage by someone who understood mountain country and wasn't afraid to take calculated risks. Red looked at Maria, who was watching him with complete trust, and at Scout, whose amber eyes reflected the firelight with ancient loyalty. They were his responsibility now, his family in all the ways that mattered. It was time to remind these hunters that they weren't the only predators in these mountains. "Stay low, stay quiet, and be ready to run," he told Maria. "The real fight is about to begin." Red moved through the darkness like a ghost from wars past, leaving Maria and Scout hidden in the mining cabin while he positioned himself among the tailings piles that surrounded the old diggings. The searchers were close now, their lights sweeping methodically through the timber, their radio chatter revealing a professional operation with military precision, but they were operating on his ground now, in terrain he'd studied for 15 years. Every loose rock, every unstable slope, every hiding place carved by long-dead miners was familiar territory. If these men wanted to hunt, Red would teach them the difference between predator and prey. The first searcher appeared at the edge of the tailings field, his infrared scope scanning for heat signatures among the scattered debris. Red watched from concealment behind a rusted ore cart, timing his breathing to minimize thermal bloom, using techniques learned in Southeast Asian jungles against an enemy that knew the ground better than he did. The irony wasn't lost on him. 40 years later, he was the one with local knowledge. And these professional killers were the outsiders stumbling through unfamiliar terrain. The searcher advanced carefully, weapon ready, following proper tactical procedure. But proper procedure didn't account for the loose shale that shifted beneath his feet, or the way sound carried differently at altitude, or the old mine shaft hidden beneath a covering of rotted boards and accumulated debris. Red waited until the man was directly above the concealed shaft, then triggered the simple trap he'd prepared, a carefully placed charge of black powder salvaged from ancient mining supplies, enough to collapse the covering and send the searcher tumbling into the 20-foot hole below. The man's scream echoed off the canyon walls before cutting off abruptly. His rifle clattered against stone, and then silence returned to the mountain night. "Contact! Man down!" Sector 7, grid reference. Red was already moving, using the confusion to reposition among the maze of mining debris. The other searchers would converge on their fallen comrade, following training that emphasized unit cohesion and mutual support. But that same training would bunch them together, making them vulnerable to someone who understood the terrain's hidden dangers. 2 more searchers appeared, moving with the quick efficiency of professionals responding to contact. They reached the collapsed mine shaft and began organizing a rescue attempt. Their attention focused downward into the hole where their partner lay groaning in pain. Red lined up his shot from behind a pile of tailings, the .45 automatic steady in his hands. 40 yards, clear sight picture, no wind to account for. An easy shot by mountain hunting standards. The first round took the lead searcher center mass, spinning him around and dropping him beside the mine shaft. The second searcher dove for cover, but Red's follow-up shot caught him in the shoulder, sending his rifle spinning away into the darkness. Radio traffic exploded across the emergency frequency. Hostile contact. Multiple casualties. We have a shooter in the mining area. All units converge on Sector 7. Use caution. This guy knows what he's doing. Red smiled grimly. They were starting to understand that they weren't hunting some panicked civilian anymore. But understanding wouldn't help them navigate terrain that could kill the unwary even without hostile action. The wounded searcher was crawling toward his dropped rifle, leaving a trail of blood in the snow. Red let him reach the weapon. A wounded man was more burden than asset to his unit, requiring resources and attention that Red's healthy opponents couldn't spare. Movement to his left made Red shift position again, flowing between cover points with the fluid motion of someone who'd spent decades reading mountain terrain. A muzzle flash lit the night as another searcher opened fire. Bullets sparking off granite and sending rock fragments flying. Red returned fire, not seeking a killing shot, but forcing his opponent to keep his head down while Red relocated to better ground. The tactical situation was developing. Exactly as he'd hoped, the searchers were being drawn into a maze of mining debris where their numbers meant nothing and their training worked against them. The radio crackled again. Cascade Base, this is Field Leader. We have multiple casualties and an active hostile. Request immediate backup and authorization for heavy weapons. Negative on heavy weapons. Collateral damage concerns. Handle with current assets. Red nodded with satisfaction. Someone higher up the chain was worried about witnesses, about evidence, about drawing too much attention to their operation. That meant the searchers couldn't call in air support or artillery, couldn't level the mountainside to eliminate one troublesome target. They had to take him the hard way, which was exactly how Red preferred to fight. A new voice came over the radio, harder and more controlled than the others. All units, this is Miguel Vasquez. I'm taking field command. The old man dies tonight and we recover the girl. No excuses, no failures. Red felt ice form in his veins. Miguel Vasquez himself was here, leading the search personally. That meant Maria was even more important than Red had realized. Important enough for a cartel leader to risk personal exposure in hostile territory. It also meant these men wouldn't give up, wouldn't retreat, wouldn't show mercy to a child who'd seen too much. This would end with either Red's death or theirs. There was no middle ground when dealing with men like Miguel Vasquez. Red checked his ammunition, 11 rounds remaining in the .45, plus 2 spare magazines. Against at least 5 more searchers, probably more if Vasquez had brought reinforcements. The odds were terrible, but Red had faced worse. And this time, he was fighting for something that mattered more than his own survival. Somewhere behind him, hidden in the mining cabin, Maria Elena Vasquez waited with Scout for his return. She trusted him to keep her safe, trusted him to be the strong man her father had taught her to recognize. Red wouldn't let her down. Miguel Vasquez emerged from the tree line like death itself, his presence commanding immediate respect from the remaining searchers. Even in the darkness, Red could see the man's authority in the way others moved to accommodate his position, the way radio chatter ceased when he raised his hand for silence. "Spread out," Vasquez ordered, his voice carrying clearly across the mining debris. "This old fool thinks he can hide from us in his junkyard. Show him what happens to people who interfere with family business." Red counted muzzle flashes as the searchers opened fire, their coordinated volleys designed to suppress any return fire while they advanced. Professional tactics, but they were still fighting Red's kind of war in Red's kind of terrain. He waited in the shadows between 2 rusted mining cars, letting the enemy reveal their positions through muzzle flash and radio communication. 5 shooters remaining, plus Vasquez himself. They were advancing in a skirmish line, weapons ready, using fire and movement to clear each piece of cover methodically. Red let them come closer, drawing them deeper into the maze of mining debris, where their coordination would be disrupted by obstacles and limited visibility. When the lead searcher passed within 10 feet of his position, Red struck with the sudden violence that had made him effective in Vietnam. The combat knife, military issue and kept razor-sharp, slid between ribs with surgical precision. The searcher dropped without a sound, his rifle clattering against stone. Red was already moving, flowing through shadows toward his next target. "Man down!" someone shouted. "Silent takedown. This bastard's right on top of us." The remaining searchers bunched together, professional training warring with human instinct for mutual protection. They'd lost the initiative, reduced to reacting to Red's moves instead of controlling the engagement. Red lined up another shot, the .45 bucking in his hands as he put a round through the shoulder of a searcher who'd exposed himself too long. The man spun and dropped, cursing in Spanish as his rifle flew into the darkness. There. "Muzzle flash at 2 o'clock. Automatic weapons fire raked Red's former position, bullets sparking off metal and shattering stone. But Red was already gone, using the mining debris like a three-dimensional chessboard where every move opened new possibilities. Vasquez's voice cut through the chaos. "Enough! You're shooting at shadows while he picks you apart." A pause, then, "Bring the girl." Red's blood turned to ice. Through his concealed radio, he heard new voices. Men he hadn't accounted for, searchers who'd been positioned as backup or security for their leader. They were moving toward the mining cabin, toward Maria and Scout. Red abandoned stealth for speed, racing through the debris field toward the cabin. Behind him, muzzle flashes lit the night as Vasquez's remaining men tried to track his movement. Bullets whined overhead and sparked off granite, but Red had the advantage of knowing exactly where he was going. He reached the cabin's perimeter as the first of Vasquez's men kicked in the door. Scout's barking echoed from inside, followed by a child's scream and the unmistakable sound of a struggle. Red put 2 rounds through the doorway, dropping the first searcher before he could fully enter. The second man dove sideways, bringing his weapon to bear, but Red was already moving around the cabin's corner. The .45 boomed again, and the second searcher pitched backward into the snow. But more were coming. Red could hear boots crunching through snow, voices coordinating an assault on the small building. Inside the cabin, Maria's voice rose in terror. "Red! Red, help me!" Scout's barking had turned to growls and the sound of combat. The old dog was giving everything he had to protect the child, but courage couldn't overcome the limitations of age and arthritis. Red burst through the cabin's rear window in a shower of glass and splintered wood, landing in a combat roll that brought him up with the .45 ready. 2 more searchers were inside, one trying to subdue Maria, while the other held Scout at gunpoint. Red's first shot took the man threatening Scout, spinning him around and sending his rifle flying. The second shot caught the other searcher in the chest as he tried to use Maria as a human shield. Both men dropped, but Maria was sobbing in terror, and Scout lay motionless by the overturned wood stove, blood matting his dark fur. "Scout!" Red dropped beside the old dog, feeling for signs of life. A weak pulse. Shallow breathing. Scout was alive but badly hurt, probably internal injuries from being kicked or struck. Outside, Vasquez's voice carried deadly promise. "Old man, you have something that belongs to my family. Come out and the dog lives. Stay hidden, and I'll burn this place down around you." Red looked at Maria, who was pressed against the cabin's far wall, tears streaming down her face. Scout's amber eyes looked up at him with complete trust, even through pain and failing strength. Red had 2 rounds left in the .45, plus 1 spare magazine, against Miguel Vasquez and however many men he had left. In a burning cabin with a terrified child and a dying dog. He'd been in worse situations, but he couldn't remember when. "It's going to be okay," he told Maria, though he wasn't sure he believed it himself. Outside, Miguel Vasquez was done waiting. "Burn it," he ordered. The smell of gasoline began seeping through the cabin walls. The smell of gasoline and smoke filled the cabin as flames began licking at the eastern wall. Red knew he had maybe 3 minutes before the fire became unstoppable, maybe 5 before the roof collapsed. Maria huddled against the far wall, her eyes wide with terror, but still trusting him to find a way out of this nightmare. Scout struggled to lift his head, ember eyes clouded with pain, but still alert to the danger surrounding his family. The old dog tried to stand, failed, and settled for a low growl directed at the voices outside. "Easy, boy," Red whispered, checking his ammunition one last time. 2 rounds in the .45, plus 15 in the spare magazine. Against Miguel Vasquez, and at least 2 remaining searchers, the radio crackled with Vasquez's voice. "Old man, this is your last chance. Bring me the girl, and I'll make it quick. Force me to come in there, and you'll all burn together." Red looked at Maria, who was watching him with the same absolute trust she'd shown throughout their ordeal. She believed he would save her, believed he was strong enough to overcome whatever evil threatened them. The weight of that trust was heavier than any burden he'd carried in Vietnam. "Maria," he said softly, "I need you to listen very carefully. When I say go, you take Scout and crawl out that back window. Stay low, stay quiet, and head for the ridge trail we talked about. What about you? I'll be right behind you." It was a lie, and they both knew it. But some lies were kinder than truth, and Red had told enough harsh truths for one lifetime. The fire was spreading faster now, encouraged by the old cabin's dry timber and the accelerant Vasquez's men had poured around the structure. Smoke was getting thicker, making breathing difficult and visibility worse. Red moved to the front window and peered through a gap in the boards he'd nailed over the opening years ago. 3 figures were visible in the firelight, Vasquez and 2 remaining searchers, positioned to cover all possible escape routes. But they'd made one mistake. They were focused on the cabin, watching for desperate escape attempts, not paying attention to the unstable mining debris that surrounded their position. The same terrain that had allowed Red to eliminate their companions could work against them. Red pulled the emergency radio from his pack and tuned to a frequency he'd memorized, but hoped never to use the Colorado. "State Patrol Emergency Channel. Mayday." "Mayday," he said quietly. "This is Henry Mallory at the abandoned silver mine complex, Sector 12, San Juan National Forest. I have armed hostiles attempting to kidnap a child. Request immediate law enforcement response." He repeated the message twice, knowing it might be hours before help arrived, but hoping someone was listening. Then he set the radio to continuous transmission, creating an electronic beacon that could guide rescue teams to their location. Outside, Vasquez was losing patience. "Burn them out. I want this finished." Red made his decision with the cold clarity that had kept him alive through 3 tours in Vietnam. He would buy Maria the time she needed to escape, whatever the cost to himself. "Go," he told Maria, "now." She started to protest, but Red was already moving toward the front door, 45 ready. Maria gathered, Scout in her arms. The old dog was smaller than he looked beneath his thick coat, and struggled toward the back window. Red kicked open the front door and emerged into the firelight with guns blazing. His first shot took one of the searcher's center mass, dropping him beside a pile of tailings. His second shot went wide as automatic weapons fire forced him to dive for cover behind an overturned ore cart. "There's the old bastard," Vasquez shouted. "Take him!" But Red was already moving, using every piece of cover the mining site offered. Behind him, he heard Maria struggling through the back window with Scout, her small voice whispering encouragement to the injured dog. The remaining searcher appeared from behind a rusted hauling engine, assault rifle ready. Red put 3 rounds into his center mass, the .45's heavy slugs punching through body armor and dropping the man like a felled tree. That left Miguel Vasquez. The cartel leader stepped into the open, his own weapon trained on Red's position. In the firelight, his face showed no fear, only the cold calculation of a man accustomed to violence. "You've cost me a lot of good men, old soldier," Vasquez said conversationally. "And for what?" "A child who was never yours to protect," "She's 8 years old," Red replied, moving to keep the ore cart between them. "That makes her everybody's responsibility. In your world, maybe. In mine, family is business, and business requires sacrifices." Red counted his remaining ammunition, 11 rounds. Vasquez was taking his time, probably waiting for backup, or trying to determine if Maria had escaped. Either way, Red couldn't let this drag out. "Miguel Vasquez," Red called out. "I have a message from your brother." Vasquez's face darkened. "My brother is dead." "Maybe, but his daughter is going to live. She's going to grow up free of your poison, and someday she'll remember what her father taught her about being strong. You think you've won something here?" Vasquez laughed, a sound like breaking glass. "I have unlimited resources, unlimited reach. Even if you kill me, others will come. The girl will never be safe." Red smiled, thinking of Maria's courage, her determination to survive despite everything the world had thrown at her. "You don't know much about mountain children, do you? They're tougher than they look." In the distance, the sound of helicopters carried on the thin air. Colorado State Patrol, probably, responding to his emergency call. Help was coming, but it would arrive too late to affect the outcome of this confrontation. Vasquez heard the aircraft too, and his expression hardened. Time to end this. He raised his weapon, but Red was already moving, the .45 bucking in his hands as he put the rest of his magazine into the man who would have destroyed a child's future for the sake of cartel politics. Miguel Vasquez dropped into the snow and lay still, his blood dark against the white ground. Red walked over and checked for a pulse, found none, and felt something release in his chest. Not relief. Exactly, but a sense of completion. Some fights were worth having, some stands worth making. Behind him, the cabin collapsed in a shower of sparks and burning timber, taking with it the last physical remnant of his mountain sanctuary. But as he looked up the ridge where Maria and Scout had disappeared, Red realized he'd found something more valuable than solitude. He'd found purpose again. The helicopters were getting closer now, their rotors beating against the thin air like mechanical heartbeats. Soon there would be questions, investigations, paperwork, all the complications that came with returning to the world of other people. But for now, Red Mallory stood alone in the snow and watched the sun rise over the San Juan Mountains, knowing that somewhere on those peaks, a little girl and an old dog were making their way towards safety. It was enough. It was more than enough. It was everything.